Well, hi, everyone. I am Sonal Shah. I'm the CEO of the Texas Tribune. How many of you have heard of the Texas Tribune? How many of you read the Texas Tribune? Excellent. We got to get the rest of you to read the Texas Tribune. We are the major statewide newspaper in Texas that covers the State House and issues around health, education, energy, environment. So if you want to know anything about Texas and news, you should look at the Texas Tribune. It is my sincere pleasure and honor to be here with you with Ambassador Katherine Tai. She is the U.S. Trade Representative for the United States. We're going to start with a very basic question. So let me just start here with all of you. How many of you know about USTR? All right, about a quarter of the audience.
Pretty good.
Let's just start with the main question then. What does USTR actually do? And then we'll get into AI and how it all works together.
That's fantastic, and I think that this is absolutely the right place to start because I spent a lot of time traveling the United States, and a lot of the thinking behind it is to take a job which is traditionally outward-looking, very international, and as we like to say, put the U.S. back into USTR. It's actually the best self-describing title. My job is to represent the interests of the United States in trade, in our conversations with other countries, to define the parameters for how we trade goods, how we trade services, and just how we economically engage with each other. By statute, my job is to be the principal advisor, spokesperson, and negotiator for the president on matters of trade policy. So what does that mean?
Yeah.
I think that this is a really important question. Let me just take the negotiations piece. When we negotiate international trade agreements and international trade rules, they sit on top of our own legal system. And what trade rules do is, if you think about our domestic system of laws as being in a picture or a photograph or a screen, right? Very, very dynamic. What the trade rules do is they create a frame around everything that's happening domestically. So traditionally what we've done is in our negotiations with other countries, we'll say, this is how we approach regulating X industry, food safety, for example. And we will negotiate with other countries to make sure that their systems work with ours. And oftentimes, if we have a more advanced system, we will, push the logic and the parameters of our system because it's something that has been developed, is working for us, and if it can work with other countries, that would be great.
So, for example, when food comes in from other countries, you want to make sure that the safety standards are the same.
Exactly. And then when our food goes to other countries, we would like for their system to be able to work a lot like ours, right? So that's where we have established approaches to regulation and rules domestically to make them work with the frame outside of it so that it can be consistent. In an area like technology, digital, the economy, just everything that's happening in our society and changing the way that we live, we work, and the way that we trade. The important question is, with everything that's going on in terms of reality, in terms of regulatory processes and governance questions, is now the right time for us to be drawing that frame around the domestic landscape.
So one could argue that, let's dive right into AI and algorithms, right? Algorithms, first of all, have been around for a long time, so this is not a new concept that we're talking about, but almost it's borderless, right? So if you think about trade of goods and services, you've got borders. Things are coming in, you're shipping things out, but now you're talking about data and digital where it's borderless. How does USTR play a role and put a frame on something that has been borderless for so long?
Yeah, it's a really great question. Traditionally, when we have applied USTR's tool set to issues like algorithms, what we've done is to think about data, source code algorithms as things that facilitate a traditional kind of trade. But to your point, this digital economy has moved way, way beyond, a container of things crossing a border, crossing a sea and crossing a border. So what we're realizing is the traditional way we've approached algorithms as part of source code in our trade agreements was to think about source code and algorithms as part of a company's secret sauce. We've approached it kind of the way that we would have approached Coca-Cola's secret formula, as a trade secret that needs to be protected. So, how do we enable for foreign companies to access our market, our companies to access foreign markets without being forced to disclose their trade secrets by the other government? What we're realizing now, though, is that source code and algorithms are way more powerful and far-reaching, that they're not just about the trade secret or the secret sauce that makes a product unique, that they are impacting our democracy itself. And again, right, you know that I'm a trade specialist, and I am reaching out of my traditional bailiwick to understand better what's going on and to connect myself to other conversations. So just in terms of algorithms, right, we see algorithms distorting important decision-making, structural and infrastructural systems with baked-in discrimination. And that is going to impact the civil rights of Americans. So once you understand that, you realize, oh, this isn't just the secret sauce that makes a product unique. This has far-reaching implications. Another way that we see algorithms operating inside of the economy and our society is in affecting the information ecosystem, in pushing disinformation. That also has profound effects on our democracy. So again, this is an area where, as trade negotiators, we're taking a moment to say, whoa, something we've traditionally thought about in very traditional commercial terms has actually got far-reaching implications. We need to take a step back, make sure that we understand what is going on, we understand the policy debate, and then we can figure out, is the time right to be drawing that frame around our domestic regulatory system, or do we need to figure out what the American approach is going to be before we're prepared to start engaging in that international conversation?
One question that people may ask is, first of all, is the government able to regulate at this point? Two, are these trade agreements as they were set up outdated for the times that we live in? Mm-hmm. And how do you think about that today? Mm-hmm.
I think that this is a really powerful question in terms of understanding exactly where we started this conversation, which is what is USTR, who is USTR, what is our role? Whether government is going to be able to regulate, it needs to have a chance to do so. This is an aspect of trade law and policy and trade negotiations that I'm very, very conscious of, which is once we draw that frame, we've created the boundaries for how far governments need to go and beyond which governments cannot go. At this point of dynamism and volatility in terms of the evolution, explosion of technology, and this growing awareness on the parts of governments who work for the public interest, that they need to be able to interact with everything that's going on in technology to assert where the public interest needs to be safeguarded and when it needs to be affirmed. It is my strong feeling as the trade representative that we have to exercise, and certainly from the trade perspective, an amount of executive restraint to let for our legislators, our policymakers, to let our democracy decide what are the American values that are going to prevail in this moment of technology evolution that's defining not just how our economy works, but how our very society is going to evolve. At this point in time, trade needs to know its place. And that's not to say we should sit on our hands and watch the world go by. That means that we need to be actively engaging with all of the other policymakers, plugging ourselves in, listening, communicating with the debates domestically to be able to position ourselves for success. There's nothing worse for American trade policy than for Americans and American policymakers to feel like we are forcing an answer that hasn't been matured, or that we are going to limit the ability of Americans to respond to change.
So one of the things that we see consistently is the lack of trust in institutions, lack of trust in media, a lack of trust in government, whether it's the legislative branch or the executive branch. How do you think about misinformation and disinformation from a world and from a trade perspective?
Yeah. So this is one of the questions that I really think is important for us to highlight. Part of the reason why I'm so happy to be here with you in your role as the CEO of the Texas Tribune. Talk about trust. The digital economy and the digital world is defining the information ecosystem that we all live and work in. And that element of lack of trust in the information in this ecosystem, the lack of mechanisms for ensuring integrity in terms of fact, is something that is profoundly consequential for our democracy. And so this is an element of plugging into different conversations that I really want to highlight, because for USTR, we are traditionally seen as a commercial and economic discipline. The issue of the business models of our technology companies, of the distributors and platforms and hosts for content creation and content distribution is, I think, creating some real questions around what interests this business model is serving. So, a business model oriented towards clicks, a business model based on what is now popularly understood and discussed as surveillance capitalism, is all about a business model that is generating profit based on data, the movement of data, the aggregation of data, and what you do with people's data. I think that what is really interesting for me is to see how that business model is coming into contact and conflict with the business model of traditional media. And I'll just share with you, from our parochial vantage point of being USTR, recently, just a week and a half ago, we were in Abu Dhabi for the 13th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization. And we wanted to stay in good contact with the beat reporters who were going to Abu Dhabi with us. And as we were reaching out to the different outlets, we were discovering so many of our beat reporters who have been laid off just in the past couple months, who were not available to come with us, and reading about what's happening at the LA Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. There is a moment of comeuppance for the traditional media business model. So why am I tracking all of this? Because this relates directly to the impacts from what we might negotiate right now or what we need to negotiate in the future. And I think that understanding the tensions here is really important, because all that is implicated right now is the health of our democracy, the ability of our citizens, our fellow Americans, to have access to information and to have access to information with integrity. What we are going through right now feels to me like a tremendous moment of transformation. I don't know where it's going to go, but this is where I might turn the tables and ask you, in your position as the head of a traditional media outlet, where are the pressures that are coming at you? And from my perspective then, as U.S. trade representative, that understanding of the pressures you're facing is going to impact how we choose to engage right now and where we need to leave space.
I mean, I think our biggest challenge, and we're traditional in the sense that we have beat reporters and all of that, but we're digital first and have always been digital first. But I think the challenge in the media industry is digital first doesn't mean that there's a great business platform for this. Like your information is being read on platforms, it's not being read on your site. And so people aren't reading, they're not coming, when they read it on Apple News, they're not coming to our site, they're reading it on Apple News, and the revenue goes to Apple News. And then we have to track how many people on Apple News might have read it, but we just track whether it's the #1 story. I'm using that as an example, but I think the challenge, I would say, and I'd flip the question, how do we get information that is reliable and trusted to people in the formats in which they want to read it? And what's the best way to do that? Because really the thing that we worry about the most is when there is no news, corruption increases, participation in elections decreases, participation of people even wanting to run for office decreases because there's no one holding governments accountable.
Yes.
So, I had a conversation with a mayor yesterday, and she said, the news outlet in her town has shut down, and so now there's no news, no local news for the community. And she's like, I need them to hold me accountable because it's how I hear from my citizens.
Yes.
And that's sort of a question that we ask. So let's then go right into democracy, right? Because democracy is sort of the big question on everyone's mind.
Yes.
Like, a lack of access, algorithms telling you where to go. How do we think about democracy in this moment with mis and disinformation? What are people going to get? How do they know if something's true or not? How do they know if you're saying something or if someone just took something you said and modified it?
Yes. So what I'm taking from what I've just heard you say is that actually the fourth estate is going through a series of pressures. And the fourth estate is one of the most important democratic institutions that we have when it comes to accountability. But from my perspective, in terms of being inside of the government, for accountability in the sense of getting credit, communicating what we're trying to do on behalf of the American people and the public interest. I think that the tensions that you've described in terms of the business models, how do we allow for local journalism to come back, to flourish? That is a really important aspect of what we need to take into account in designing these trade rules. Because I think that the worst thing that could happen right now for our democracy is for us to move into trade negotiations, to bake into that framework, that frame, rules that are going to limit the ability of the fourth estate to reflourish, or rules that are going to bake in the advantages for business models that are eroding our democracy.
So do you and other trade negotiators actually have this conversation on democracy and information and misinformation, or how does that work?
Not yet.
Okay.
And I think that that is really where we need to go, because I think that the conversation in trade negotiations needs to shift from where it is. What are the words on the page around who gets to decide where data flows, how freely, and under what circumstances it can be restricted, to a broader question, right? That's, I feel like, taking the world as it is and trying to move words around and maybe modifying on the margins. I think the more important question that we should be asking here at home, but also with our fellow trade negotiators, is what is a digital trade agenda? What is a digital trade agreement that is going to be pro-worker, pro-competition, and pro-democracy? And if we start with those values, that we need a digital economy and a way to engage with other economies digitally that is going to empower our people as workers and as citizens, as human beings, that is going to generate a vibrancy that allows for competition and opportunity as opposed to locking in big players to continue to dominate. And how do we do this in a way that allows our democracy to continue to thrive? Those are the touchstones for how we move forward, and I am looking forward to more of my counterparts coming to the conversation, framing the question appropriately. I think it is really important. In order to get to the right and the best result, you have to start by asking the right questions. And I think that this question around a pro-democracy, digital economy, digital trade agenda is the right starting point.
Well, I think we might have room for 2 questions. So anybody have a question? Please.
Hi.
The mic is coming.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Hi. And I don't want to block everyone, so I'll sit down since you can see me. Small businesses, as you were mentioning, in the app economy, they depend on tech platforms for several things, including access to a global market. In 2023, there was a report of foreign trade barriers, and USTR identified the DMA, which took effect last week, as a potential barrier. There are some potential concerns about how the DMA could degrade platform services that a lot of small businesses in the US, small tech companies, depend on, including privacy and security. But I was just wondering, as you prepare for the upcoming TTC meetings, if you intend to raise some of these concerns with European counterparts.
So it's true that this was in the 2023 report as a potential barrier, and that does reflect our traditional approach to trade, which is to look at regulatory activities from other countries and to see how they might impact American company interests. I think that the DMA is a really, really good example of the cusp of change and the cusp of increased nuance that we are bringing, especially to digital economy issues. When we're talking about the platforms, yes, I know a lot of small businesses have told me that the platforms are creating the entry point for them to connect with the global economy. And that's a wonderful thing. That's something that we should celebrate because it is about opening up more opportunities, especially for the small and the medium companies. Here's the issue. Shouldn't we have more platforms then? Right? Shouldn't we have more opportunities like that? And I think the DMA's approach is to look at some of these platforms and to look at their role as what they call gatekeepers. But as we're connecting the trade conversation with the competition and anti-monopoly conversation, the other way I might frame that is some of these platforms serving as the holders of choke points. Right? Being a platform like that, yes, when you're operating in the best possible terms, you're creating opportunities. But when there aren't enough of those types of platforms, what that means is those platforms have a lot of power to determine when and how those opportunities can be accessed by the smalls and the mediums. So that's an aspect of our trade policy that is in formation right now, which is to not rely on our old instincts of, what's the nationality of your company and, whose side I should be fighting on. Right now, the question that we're looking at is, what's the pro-democracy, pro-competition, pro-worker angle? And it is shifting the conversation that we're having. Thank you.
There's a question right behind you. I'm sorry. Right there. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Victoria Virasing from the Noble Reach Foundation. So you mentioned, pro-worker, pro-competition, pro-democracy. How do you think about some of the protectionist policies that are coming into place, thinking, post-globalization? Obviously, we have a global threat competition with adversaries in China and Russia, and a lot of that is going to be held in the AI and a lot of the emergent technology. So how do you think about the trade-offs between understanding where protectionist policies leverages American competitiveness, but also leveraging our allies and our partners in this global AI community?
So I'm going to push back a little bit on some of your terminology because I think for a generalist audience here at South by Southwest, I don't know that the baggage that comes along with some of the vocabulary gets translated, but for the larger audience in the trade community, what I would say is I just push back on the description of the policy changes that we're seeing as necessarily protectionist. If you just break down the word protection, usually you want to protect something that's valuable to you, right? But protectionism in the tradition of trade policy suggests you're protecting something and beggaring your neighbor at the same time. I don't think that's what you mean in terms of how you framed your question. I think your question is, how are we thinking about this next generation of policies, how we're going to approach in a more strategic way? That just, liberalizing and just being very, very open might not be the right answer because there are a lot of forces that we have to defend against. So one example maybe would be the executive order that just came out 2 weeks ago on protecting Americans' data, right? So there you have the word protect, But I want to say that that's a really positive form of the word protect, because what it's doing is protecting Americans, you, me, all of us, our data when it comes to our sensitive data, our health data, as an example, from flowing to parts of the world where we lose control of that data, and that data could be used against us as individuals and us as a country. So I think what you are really right to put your finger on is we also need to engage in this larger, more strategic look at data, the digital economy, algorithm, and source codes as a collective. And I think that also goes to issues of our privacy rights, our individual rights, our intellectual property rights, and also our security as a nation. And I think that what you're identifying is basically the cutting edge of the conversation where trade, national security, democracy, and rights are all coming together. And I'm actually really glad that we're grappling with these issues, because these are the hard questions that we're going to need to figure out how to address and to navigate.
One final question.
Okay.
Sorry.
Really quick.
Okay.
Hi, thanks so much for that. Kaylee Nauman, I'm with the British Embassy in DC, working on trade policy, and formerly with Sean Patrick Maloney on the Hill when you were still there.
Yes.
But I would like to sort of return to the topic of intellectual property in this context. And what I'm thinking about in particular is that the Senate had a hearing about news media, generative AI, and intellectual property. And I know that the digital and intellectual property sort of connection and trade is typically quite separate, but I would love to hear your thoughts about sort of the role in intellectual property as well in sort of the resurgence of local news media and how you're thinking about that from the USTR perspective.
I want to make you do it fast.
Yes, so that's a huge question. But let me just say this. I'm in a place like South by Southwest. I go through the demonstration tables and rooms that are going on downstairs. And I see a lot of people creating stuff. People who have technical backgrounds, who are musicians, artists, and who are making cool stuff, right? One of the questions that's entirely unanswered is what are their rights with respect to what they're creating? Whether it's through AI, whether it's the things that are being fed into the AI. There's a very famous case right now, I think New York Times, Sarah Silverman are suing some of the AI companies for the rights to their work that have been fed into these large language models. Really good question. Let's engage on that question. And I think that the secondary question then is, what does that mean for how we deal with this through trade? But the primary question is what's going on here at home in our domestic space. The trade issue is going to be how do we stay abreast of all of these questions? How do we stay abreast of how we're going to approach? And then how do we engage with other countries to elevate the way that we are approaching this in a pro-worker, pro-competition, and pro-democracy kind of way.
Ambassador Katherine Tai, thank you so much for coming here. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you so much.